Welcome to our webinar today on God Help Us, Green Oriented Development, an alternative strategy for urban densification in suburban cities with Julian, Bolleter and Alan Whiteley. We're very fortunate to have these brilliant minds here with us today. And a bit of a fun fact, I first reached out to Julian March this year. So speaking for myself, at least, this has been a long-awaited webinar. And by the looks of things, our most popular one.
Thank you. We would just like to start with a karakia, and then we'll go in with Julian's presentation. We'd like to do a karakia timatanga, which starts tuia ki runga, tuia ki raro, tuia ki roto, tuia ki waho, karongo te ao, karongo te po, humia, huia, taikia. So that means unite above, unite below, unite without, unite within, listen to the night, listen to the world. Now we come together as one.
So just briefly about the webinar, I will just introduce Julian and Alan. So Julian will speak first and then Alan will follow up. And then we'll have a Q&A, which will be managed by my colleague and project lead for the Wellington Regional Leadership Committee, Aria Franklin. To introduce Dr. Julian Bolleter, Julian is the co-director of the Australian Urban Design Research Centre at the University of Western Australia, and the program director of their Master of Urban Design course. His role at the Design Research Centre also includes conducting research projects for the Australian Research Council and the Western Australian State Government. He's an experienced urban designer and has practiced in Australia, the USA, the UK, and the Middle East. He's completed a PhD and has commercially published 6 books and has received funding from the Australian Research Council, Healthways, and the Western Australian Government. And about Alan Whiteley, Alan is the Landscape Architecture and Urban Design Director for WSP New Zealand. His experience comes through delivery of complex and large projects in New Zealand, the Middle East, and the UK. Alan's key focus has been on residential and transport infrastructure projects in which systems-wide thinking has been paramount to the success of delivery. His role at WSP ensures that a people-focused approach to urban development can deliver the outcomes of densification whilst aligning with biophilic uplift. He's passionate about advocating for the value of green space in growing cities and how they positively impact people's lives and the wider socio-environmental system. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Julian.
Okay, thank you very much, Frida, and the Wellington Regional Leadership Committee for the opportunity to speak today. It's been long anticipated and it's great to be finally doing it. I wanted to just acknowledge I'm being beamed to you from Whadjuk Noongar land, and I pay respects to their elders past, present and future, despite the recent results of the referendum here, which was very sad. We continue to pay those respects. So a quick note before I begin on my actual presentation. I get really annoyed with international experts who get jetted into Perth every few years. Perth is a very idiosyncratic city, and often I find that their prescriptions, or they tend to diagnose our problems and prescribe solutions and then jet out again without really having an understanding of what is a very idiosyncratic little city of Perth. I'm sure it's no different for you guys. So I was tempted to run the find replace function in PowerPoint and change all the mentions of Australian to Australasian, but I've stopped myself doing that for the very reason which I've just described. So I'm keen to hear from Alan what elements of my presentation make sense, could be applied, and what couldn't. So I'll leave that to him to connect those worlds, but I think there are connections to be made. So the presentation argues essentially that Australian cities and their prominence in global livability rankings like The Economist has caused us to be a little too self-congratulatory about their success or otherwise. They are confronting massive issues in terms of being bedeviled by biodiversity loss, extreme heat, bushfires, which are increasingly becoming more urban, and soaring greenhouse gas emissions. But at the same time, in amongst all that, Australia, our society is one of city dwellers, and a great number of the benefits of the Australian way of life are provided to us by our cities. They're the point at which our effect on atmospheric, geologic, hydrologic, biospheric systems is most pronounced, and where we have to find the solutions to many of the resultant urban problems. So this presentation ventures a critical appraisal. Perth, the city I live in, is at and where it's heading. The presentation is in 3 parts. The first part is called Fraying Edges. So we look at some of the issues which are manifesting on the edge of the city in terms of greenfield suburban development. Anyone in the planning community will be to some degree aware of these issues. For a number of decades now, the policy response is to be trying to deliver a compact city. But we find in the way that density is being delivered, in Perth in particular, is causing all kinds of problems and not necessarily living up to the aspirations and promises of compact city policy. So that's the Great Australian Ream. And then after what are essentially two very relentlessly negative kind of critiques of current practice in parts 1 and 2, in part 3 we weave a new dream, which is for suburban cities, which is called Greenspace Oriented Development, which is essentially where we try to marry leafy suburbia with the best aspects of density in this kind of joyous union of density and green space. Okay, so let's jump into it. So the suburban dream, which I'm sure you'll find familiar, at the dawn of the 20th century, the American planning proponent Frederick Howe wrote, "The great cities of Australia are spread out into the suburbs in a splendid way, for miles about broad roads with small houses, gardens, and an opportunity to touch with the freer, sweeter life which the country offers." So the suburban form of the early 20th century had a lot to offer. It enabled residents to produce food, which was one of the original ideas of larger lots in Australia, at least. You were able to cope with much household waste in sight in terms of composting. You could express yourself through the design of your garden and your house. You could moderate the local climate through planting, pursue a variety of hobbies in private, in a back garden. You could have pets, and you could live outdoors, relative privacy. It's the dream of suburbia is ongoing, and it's a potent one. But despite these undoubted virtues, it would appear that the suburban model adopted across Australia is running out of steam, and its once enviable livability is on the wane. One of the first and foremost issues of our nation, and I'm sure New Zealand, relates to the erasure of diversity. So globally, we're living through what is popularly known as the 6th Great Extinction. A third of all amphibian species are at risk of extinction. A fifth of the globe's mammals are classified as endangered, threatened, or vulnerable. And we could see this in Perth. This is the endemic plant associations of Perth in 1829 when Captain James Stirling sailed up the Swan River, or the Derwent Yarragon. Perth sits in here somewhere, the city centre for those who know it. And we can see after effectively 200 years of European settlement, we've done a very thorough job on the remnant plant associations of the Swan Coastal Plain. Now, some of this is to do with agriculture, but a lot of it was about suburban development, which is profligate in its use of space. And here we can see the little black dots are essentially all the development which is happening in greenfield setting in Perth since about the turn of the century. And you can see we're nibbling into areas which are environmentally sensitive and into remnant vegetation. The story of this is obviously that Perth sits within a global biodiversity hotspot. There's only 35 in the world. We know conservation of the hotspots is not optional. But in Perth, we've managed to clear 93% of that biodiversity hotspot, and we continue to nibble into it on a daily basis. We now have more species of threatened plants, 2,500, than most other Australian states, and indeed countries of the world, just in this little corner of southwest WA. Okay, so the loss of biodiversity through land clearing has been compounded by climate change. As Brendan Gleeson reminds us, the wonderful climate, the envy of the world, seems to be turning on us. Terra Australis is becoming Terror Australis, a blast furnace of drought, heat, and capricious tempests. And so we know we've just been lurching through some of the hottest years in terms of the planet and its climate, and that's really, causing all kinds of problems in terms of nature's timetable is being messed up by this changing climate, like a badly run public transport system. Seasonal insects are arriving earlier and later. Flowers have reset their clocks and are blooming in unpredictable times. And for creatures which are all dependent on each other in this amazing web of biodiversity, which eat each other or fertilize each other, such changes spell disaster. We're having a lot of issues too around heat stress, and Australia, and to some degree Western Australia, is kind of a canary in the coal mine for climate change. So there's mounting worries about the thermal conditions in our cities. In Australia, extreme heat is the most perilous form of natural hazard. It results in a much greater proportion of death than all other natural threats. And this hot weather is becoming increasingly common and extreme. For instance, the last decade was Australia's hottest on record. And here we can see a mapping here from climate change in Australia, showing some areas of WA potentially under a fairly severe climate model, increasing their average max daily temperature in 2090 by 4 or 5 degrees, which is, extremely concerning. These are not cool places to begin with. And I'll be interested in your reflections on this, but this is how we're currently seeking to adapt to climate, which is more or less ignoring it. This is a fairly typical subdivision on the edge of Perth. Big black roofs, grey roofs, houses, huge houses, shoehorned onto tiny lots. The chances of ever delivering an urban forest in these settings is very low. And frankly, if you were trying to design an urban form which was not going to be adapted to climate, and you specifically set out to do that, you would probably design something like this. At the same time, we're also experiencing a drying climate, which is symptomatic of climate change. And we're experiencing groundwater shortages. So here we can see in orange the various local governments around Perth, which are all running out of groundwater or have over exceeded their groundwater allocation, typically which is used to irrigate public open space and new suburban developments. So now we're having to run massive desal plants, which are being used for exactly that purpose. Tim Flannery, the Australian scientist, warned that because of the declining availability of water, Perth will be the 21st century's first ghost metropolis. It was arguably inflammatory commentary, but there's a big question how we will deliver green and verdant suburbia given this water shortage. We're also finding that in an outer suburban situation, the water usage per capita is much higher than in an infill situation. Okay, in my next slide in this relentlessly negative presentation, years of extended drought conditions with climate change have also produced a series of infernos. So there was the 2003 Canberra fires, which caused a lot of damage to the outskirts of Canberra, the disastrous 2009 Black Saturday fires, and the epic mega fires of the 2021 suburb. What does this mean for the suburbs? Well, the issue is for new greenfield developments as they nibble into that biodiversity hotspot. They create a very long and complicated edge with what is often remnant biodiversity. And this makes for a city edge which is very difficult to protect by the fire and emergency services. So there's a real vulnerability being revealed here. And this is official areas designated as fire-prone areas. So this is not me being hysterical, but we have a real issue here on the fringe. At the same time as our cities are bracing for the impact of climate change, they're becoming less affordable and less egalitarian, which is a problem for a society like Australia, which is national identity is to such a large degree predicated on this kind of fair go, kind of mateship sort of culture. So surging house prices in all the cities, but particularly Sydney and Melbourne, have kept them near the list of the world's least affordable countries and cities. So a typical Australian house costs about 5.6 times the median household income in Sydney, which is the second least affordable city in the world, with prices some 12.2 times incomes. And we can see a new urban divide forming in our cities. So this is Perth, and it's showing relative levels of social deprivation or socioeconomic deprivation. And we can see much of that deprivation, which is shown here with areas with a low score. In many cases, this is concentrated on fringe or far-flung suburbs. So it kind of challenges long-held ideals of fairness. And it's really about this gap which is opening up between people on the edge of the city, where there's not much in the way of public transport, where you don't have access to well-paid jobs, and the people who live near the city and who have access to the knowledge economy jobs and accessible locations. Compounding this is unaffordable transport. So obviously there was a lot of really kind of apocalyptic projections around peak oil, which at that time, which was earlier, probably in the 2010s, didn't really manifest. No doubt in time they will. And it's getting harder and harder to, for people in fringe locations, obviously often needing 2 or 3 cars to get the kids to work, to get the kids to uni, to get to work. We have this kind of narrative pushed by the tech billionaires that e-cars will save us. But obviously for those people living in outer suburban locations, paying $65,000 for a Tesla is not necessarily going to be on the card. So eco-modernisation at current prices is not really affordable, so it's not necessarily the answer. We can see this here. Perth has a kind of spoke model of public transport or heavy rail access, which is very difficult to be used to give access to those outer suburbs, although there are some big projects underway to do that. So one of the flow-on effects of this kind of lack of jobs and punishing commutes and mortgage repayments and more broadly social deprivation on the fringe can be the development of chronic mental health issues. Moreover, the Australian philosopher Glenn Albrecht coined the term soulstalgia to mean a form of psychic or existential distress caused by environmental change, to describe the unhappiness of people whose landscapes are being transformed about them by forces beyond their control. He proposed this new term to describe this distinctive form of homesickness which comes with climate change. And we can see here in terms of psychological distress of people, out of 100, again, a lot of concentration in the outer suburbs here, perhaps because of some of the reasons we've talked about. So this is showing psychological distress per 100 people. We find in some outer suburban locations, this is getting up to 11 or 12 people. The World Health Organization has predicted that depression will be soon the second most biggest devastating disease in the world. And certainly, I think some marginalized areas of Perth are kind of harbingers in this respect. So given all these worrying issues which are facing fringe development, how we're reacting? Well, the narrative is one of urban densification. So we've been on an urban densification drive now for some 2 or 3 decades. And it's based on the idea that density can be used as a crude lever for forcing sustainability outcomes. So across the nation, we're trying to do about 60% future development as infill development within the existing urban growth boundaries. In reality, we might only do about half of that, and in Perth, generally, it is about half of that. And a lot of it's coming really for us, not through so much precinct redevelopment, but just the ad hoc subdivision of once quarter-acre lots in sort of inner ring greyfield suburbia into a number of smaller homes, which we call background infill. And you can see a classic case of it here in the middle ring suburbs, where once generous lots have been hacked up into much smaller survey strata lots. But what we're finding is it often doesn't deliver the kind of benefits we've been told that density will deliver for us. And I think there's been also, and I'm not sure if it's the same in New Zealand, a kind of an ideology that's been pushed by planning that sprawl is bad and infill is good, and often a focus on the data and the numerics around how many dwellings we've delivered in the form of infill, as opposed to a more qualitative assessment of what it's producing on the ground. So that's something we attempt to do in this second part of the presentation. So here, what we've done here is to map all the little black dots effectively within the last couple of decades in Perth, which is mostly background infill. And we can see that a lot of it's not actually occurring near any regional significant open space. So people's access to nature is not necessarily being delivered through this form of infill. When we look at actually public open space, which is smaller parks, we can see there is greater access to parks where this density is occurring. This is, all exploring the kind of compensation hypothesis, which is the idea that as people live in a higher density setting, they'll seek out nature. But what we find in Perth is that many of the parks have not been upgraded to really support this densification. This is a park near where I lived, time-lapse photography every 3 hours over a typical weekend day, experiencing no single person using it. So there's a real question here to how parks need to be upgraded to deliver amenity and to deliver this experience of nature which people in high density settings seek to experience. So in Perth, only about 22% of parks have significant trees. Only 10% have about significant wildlife function, and 74% of our parks have an ubiquitous underlay of reticulated turf, poorly suited to Perth's dry climate. And 54% have no walking paths. So this is not an exception in this park here. This is a pretty typical example of underperforming greyfield open space. The other thing we're finding in Perth is where these little black dots are all happening is that it's really eroding urban forest canopy cover. So those suburbs that were well organised, well connected, well resourced and could fight off infill development, riverside suburbs like we see here in Dalkeith, they have a very high urban forest canopy cover, can be hitting 40%, where areas where the community didn't have the resources to really resist infill, we find that those numbers can be as low as 5% urban forest canopy cover, which is a really worrying thing. Most of the trees are in private lots in Perth, and as governments have had not very much chance to regulate and give them statutory protection. So this is a typical Perth suburb, such as like I grew up in. And then when background infill was sort of run right, we can see what's happened there. I mean, for some people, I guess historically, the urban forest was just like the trimmings, you know. But obviously, it's crucial to urban livability in terms of the ecosystem services it provides. I mean, it regulates the local climate, it sequesters carbon, it purifies water, and provides habitats to plants and animals and clean air, which is good if you like breathing, and obviously physical and mental health benefits. It's been shown that just looking at nature produces these benefits, even if you don't interact with it directly. And there's a lot of studies to show that even things like domestic violence is lower in areas where you have a view of nature. So anyway, there could be all a number of different factors there, but we know that it's hugely important. But the other thing we're finding is that when you have these areas of a lot of background infill, for instance, you're not getting a lot of activity. People are not necessarily recreating very much. In areas where you have more open space and the streets are greener, and you've got better urban canopy cover in the streets, we're finding that physical activity is much higher. So the huge implications there. We can see heavy rail again. Much of the infill we're doing is not serviced by heavy rail. Sure, it's serviced by buses, but Perth buses are a long-term project. Pack your lunch and bring a book would be my recommendation. And so while some of these areas are well serviced by buses, it's obviously not really getting people out of cars very much. And we can see that here in terms of the car dominance. The number of people who drove to work in some of these areas is really high, 50 to 70%. So really this urban form, despite what we've been promised about the compact city, is not delivering the benefits we want. I mean, this is what the state government is trying to do, which is these little pink dots are our transit-orientated developments. We call them activity centres. Well, there hasn't been much activity in a lot of them. It's been very difficult to corral free market sort of development into these neat little zones around transit. So we have two models going on in our cities. One is the kind of this very neat nodal kind of model which exists in the minds of planners, and then we have something which is going on the ground, which is the black dots of ad hoc background infill development. And the two actually are very, very different to each other and sort of kind of sit next to each other and don't interact. This is near where I live, the 50 shades of grey. So this is some of the infill which is going in. So we're losing the leafy greenness of the suburbs, but without necessarily benefiting from the urban amenity. This is a view from my roof. Sorry, this expression, pride as a fish's ass, may not be a New Zealand thing. So excuse my parochial humour. But again, we have big lots shoehorned into suburban back gardens. The Ned Kelly, he was the bushranger who had the helmet with a little slot in it. We're getting a lot of these kind of slots opening up, and we have the flaneur from 19th century Paris. It is not incubating the gastronomy of the eye, which the flaneurs so sought out as they strolled the arcades of Paris in the 19th century. We are losing the leafy greenness of the suburbs, but without really getting the urban amenity, activation, diversity that you would hope for. And not surprisingly, the public have, that I think communities are pretty wise to what bad urban development is. They may not be able to explain exactly why they don't like it, but they generally got a pretty good feeling when things are being delivered, which I think diminishing the livability of where they live. The British sociologist Peter Marris argued that people cannot reconcile themselves to the loss of familiar attachment in terms of some impersonal utilitarian calculation of the common good. So what he's saying there is basically, the argument that planners make that we need to stop sprawl to make a compact city, so therefore you should accept density in the area, is not making much sense to our populations. They may also understand that sprawl is a bad thing, but that doesn't mean they're going to support the loss of mature trees in their street, the loss of green space. It doesn't mean they're going to accept a lot more traffic and parking hassles, for instance. And I think, given the importance of the home environment to people's psychological and physiological well-being, they're quite right to be resistant. So in Perth, we call these people NIMBYs, pejoratively, rightly or wrongly, but it's actually gone more towards bananaism. So NIMBY stands for not in my backyard. Bananaism is actually build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. Okay, so it's actually probably getting worse. In Australian cities, about 13% of people support density in their neighbourhood. So it's a really low figure. It could even be lower in Perth, you know. So we conducted some big surveys. So this is a survey we ran, which was called Density My Way. This was mostly focused in Perth, and it actually showed different models of density around a central train station. One was a typical TOD, one was a G.O.D, which is density around Greenspace, one was COD, which is density along a corridor, and one was background infill, which is density in back gardens. And what we found was that there was a real animosity around the density in back gardens, but the communities are more on board with precinct scale redevelopment. The problem is we're just not doing much of that, and there's some real hurdles. So, okay, that was very negative. I apologize for that. And I know as an academic, it's easy just to throw darts at everything, all these well-intentioned policy outcomes. But I wanted to actually now be a little more propositional and go, what could be a Australian or suburban dream for the 21st century? So we think it could be green space oriented development. And it's part of this idea that Brendan Gleeson makes, that we need to make our cities lifeboats, which can really take us through the coming crises of climate change and resource scarcity, you know. So this whole idea of how do you transition your cities into lifeboats where they're able to adapt and not just cope with these problems we're facing, but actually live with them in some way that we, you know, makes them resilient and worthwhile. And so this is what God is really trying to do. And my apologies to Ebenezer Howard here. Someone would recognize his face and his diagram even more, the 3 magnets diagram. Influenced the Garden City movement, where he sought to bring together town and country in a joyous union of town country in the form of garden cities. What we're trying to do is essentially, I've bastardized this diagram here, to bring together the benefits of transit-oriented development, which is some transit connectivity, some urban amenity and activation, and with the benefits of suburbia, of green space, of leafy green streets, and parks, and to bring those two things together and marry those things together in G.O.D, green space orientated development. And we're hoping that this way it actually can resonate with the lifestyle aspirations of people who live in suburbs. So this is what it looks like. Essentially, this is, never mind where this is in Perth, but essentially what we're doing is taking parks which are about a 15-minute walk of transit. So here's a heavy rail train station. And the idea is essentially that you upgrade parks so that they act as a kind of multifunctional communal backyard for the people who live around them, but also who are in the more broader catchment. So what you're getting here is green space amenity, but also some connectivity to transit. So we all know the idea of transit-oriented development, right? Which is that you put people near a train station and they catch the train more. It's a simple idea, and I mean, it's a compelling one. And so there's kind of synergies there with people's location to transit and how they live and move around. It's a bit reductive, though, in the sense that often it can be kind of reduced down to, you know, it makes it easy to get to work or whatever. Now, obviously, our TODs should be delivering more than that, but it can be a bit of a reductive narrative. But what I would propose is with G.O.D, that the benefits could be quite significant. So the upgraded park, you know, it provides improved physical health, improved mental health, increased social cohesion. This is for all the people living around it who are using it and viewing it. Biodiversity conservation, noise reduction, carbon sequestration, local climate regulation, air purification, water purification, and infiltration. So, you know, a park in an appropriate form is offering a huge amount of benefits to the people living around it. But the other thing is there's a kind of synergy here, you know, it's synergistic density in terms of the benefits of the densified urban form are also significant. So by having people living at a greater density around parks, you have increased passive surveillance of the park, you have more capital for park maintenance, the community can be involved in the park maintenance, they can help activate the park, you can use grey water for irrigation, nutrients from communal composting in the park. So there's all these synergies which flow both ways. It's a truly synergistic form of density. You know, in Perth, a lot of our parks from the middle ring suburbs were really about the recreation movement from the 1950s, which was this idea that we all needed to run around to temper moral influences. So there's a huge focus on team sports, a lot of ovals. And you know, look, this is a really important thing, but I think with many of our parks, there's underutilized space, which could be more multifunctional, could deliver more uses for more people. And certainly they could be performing much more in terms of ecological roles. So here, basically, we have the upgraded park. So you are maintaining an oval, but trying to use it more heavily. What we have here on the left-hand side, if you can see it, and I might just go back a couple of slides so it was a bit clearer. This is the idea of a multifunctional loose fit space where different functions can be programmed over time and can change over time. So it's like a grid of different spaces which serve different functions. Some of them, you know, it might be a skate park. Some might be volleyball, some might be shipping containers for artists, some might be spaces for, you know, trampolines or exercising dogs or growing food. And these kind of functions, or having parties, you know, there's a pavilion, these kind of functions can move over the time, but it's a sort of orchestrated multifunctionality, which is constantly in a state of flux. It's the idea of this loose fit space, which would define this closer edge of the park. Trying to create passive walking loops, also trying to really downplay the roads around the park and try and actually have the park bleeding out into the areas around it. And we can see here in the image here, this is more G.O.D kind of precincts, all within a 15-minute walk or a 5-minute cycle of transit, and picking up these major parks which are greater than 1 hectare in area to become G.O.D parks. On the ground, before religious conversion, G.O.D would look something like this. This may be a little unfair, but to anyone who's been to Perth, this probably look quite familiar. And then afterwards, so, you know, truly trying to deliver density and green space amenity in one foul swoop. Again, here looking at that loose fit space, which we looked at before. You know, and this is research which we're just currently doing, which might be of interest, which is using EnviMet to model thermal comfort around parks. So one of the function of G.O.D parks would be to try and deliver what's called the park cool island effect. So parks can have a demonstrable influence in moderating extreme temperatures around a park, but the park has to be designed in the right way. It needs to yield a lot of shade, and it needs to be yielding a lot of evapotranspiration, which leads to cooling. And this diagram here shows the cooling effects of some parks in Perth. We can see one small park here, another one there, and the degree to which it cools the area around it. And what we're finding is that many of the new urbanism inspired parks, which are little neighborhood parks, are not really yielding much cooling to the area around them. So we need to be thinking, how do we design our parks to cool the areas around them? We need big trees. We actually need water in the landscape to produce those evapotranspirative cooling. So that's research which is ongoing. But it's not just about the parks, it's all about how people get to them. It's not much point upgrading a park if the people walking to it have to walk along a, you know, a brutally hot and kind of denuded streetscape. So we also started to propose G.O.D networks, which is where you take streets and up that kind of connect to transit, in the case here, and then through to the parks, but also connect between the parks themselves to form a kind of funnel for biodiversity. Also, you know, we have a childhood obesity epidemic in Australia, so about getting kids to school, getting them to walk along shaded streets to school. So by way of our conclusion, you know, there's often a sense in the planning community, which I would say can be a bit of an echo chamber, that you know, our attempts to achieve density are kind of working. We're bringing communities with us. Things are changing. That might be the case in Wellington, and I'm not saying it's not. But around the world, between 2000 and 2015, according to the UN, our cities are sprawling much faster than their populations are growing. So while we might be winning the battle for density in certain areas globally, we're really losing that battle. And it's leading to unprecedented urban sprawl, much in the biodiversity hotspots, which is, you know, really dangerous. So our feeling is that it's not that G.O.D should replace TOD, but our feeling is that perhaps G.O.D can actually appeal to these masses of humans around the planet who are obviously voting with their feet and saying it's the leafy green suburban livability is for them. So what we're hoping is that G.O.D can sort of speak to their aspirations in a way that perhaps in some cases TOD isn't. So God help us. There's a book on it, Greenspace Oriented Development. Happy to send a copy to Freda and she can circulate it. I've long since stopped to try and make money out of books. We're also doing another book, which is exploring G.O.D in a whole bunch of much smaller applications. such as living around communal backyards where you can share resources in this cover image. Hopefully will be published by UWA Publishing. It's called Business as Unusual. I post about it a bit on LinkedIn and it gets a storm of reaction, a lot of it negative, but we're using that in the book itself. So if you want to get onto LinkedIn and share your love or hate of some of those little quirky ideas, that would be most welcome. Yeah, thanks again to Freda, Alan and the Wellington Regional Leadership Committee, and I'll hand back to you all now.
Thank you so much, Julian. Over to you, Alan, when you're ready.
Yeah, fantastic presentation. Things that pop out to mind here is when it comes, it's kind of planning down and these decisions that get made at that level. It certainly has reminded me of kind of the recent MPSUD we've seen come in New Zealand and the medium density residential MDRS, which has had a sort of an impact on the way urbanism is perceived and kind of a concern about what the future holds in that space. Lots of facts in there. I thought I'd throw in some facts that I've come across in the last couple of days on this space that are Aotearoa based. Between 1980 and 2016, green space per person, and this is in sort of around the Auckland, Hamilton area. So green space per person fell by at least 30% in Auckland and at least 20% in Hamilton. And there's some parity here between what you were saying earlier in that there are kind of two reasons for that. Number one is infill development, seeing the conversion of yards and sections into houses and driveways in the existing areas. And then secondly, there was a shift as well towards larger houses on smaller sections, new subdivisions as well. So there's an average Papatoi back in 1970s that had a footprint of 190 square meters on average, which is situated on 800 square meters parcel of land. And then by the 2010s, suburbs like that, like Flatbush, had dwellings with an average footprint of 210 meters on sections of only 420 square meters. And, you know, whilst that still leaves quite a bit of spare space for lawns and gardens, it's normally in reality kind of sealed driveways, paths and patio areas are often quite preferred. And so we see the NPSUD and the MDRS that could potentially hold risks for urban green space. So like the MDRS in particular, with its focus on promoting medium density infill development across broad swathes of our cities, has the potential to accelerate the ongoing reduction of that private green space, which is a real thing we need to be looking at in New Zealand. So there's a whole swathe of things we need to look at through our planning rules. An ongoing move to more densely populated areas and the emerging impacts of climate change are likely, and this is actually kind of the good news for us as designers, landscape architects, urban designers, is that urban parks, reserves, gardens, vegetation and street trees are never going to be more valuable. And that kind of, when you think about the difficulty of reestablishing green space once it's lost, means that we have to think really, really super careful about these decisions that we're making that are going to end up having long-term sort of generational change. And I guess that kind of takes us on, which is one thing I really wanted to mention today, and I think we need to do maybe some questions as well, so I'll be as quick as I can. But the idea of recalibrating the idea of green space and landscape architecture within the planning world and within the urban design world, in that we need to recalibrate it from a sort of superficial amenity related scenario to something that is really, really viewed as critical infrastructure, critical green infrastructure that will allow resilience to be part of our infrastructure world. I dug into some of the MPSUD definitions, which I thought were really, really interesting. So the MPSUD distinguishes between development infrastructure, such as three waters and road infrastructure required to new developments, and additional infrastructure being things like open space and community facilities, which puts one as an absolute need to have and another one slightly behind as a to satisfy requirements. And a recalibration as to how that is viewed, for me, is absolutely critical to create a green and much more generational approach to the decisions we're making today. Also, as we're finding in Wellington and across the country, sticking band-aids on pipes is not the solution to future megatrends that we're seeing, which is going to get warmer, it's going to get wetter. And on top of that, as Julian was saying, people are getting more unhappy. So we need to combat all of those mega trends through really great green-oriented design. And then, so that's kind of looking at it from the planning, viewing it from the planning point of view. Then an absolute necessity for us, especially in urban densification, is how we bring kaupapa Māori into the forum. As we've seen lots of urban development, we've seen Māori become disenfranchised and pulled away from the whakapapa of the land, and through a sort of kaitiaki approach and a focus on te taio, we've got a real great opportunity here to kind of scratch off the surface of colonization and kind of bad urban planning decisions, and to allow those stories and that important whakapapa to rise to the surface. That's probably like the last point I want to land on there before we go out to questions.
Kia ora everyone, ko Aria toku ingoa. I will manage the chat and questions for Alan and Julian. I see there's a few questions in here already, and lots of great comments as well. I won't read out the comments, we'll just go through the questions to start with. So we've got one here from Kieran Davis-Wall. The domestic violence data, is that correlation or causation? If green spaces are in more affluent areas, would it be safe to assume that residents are less likely to commit domestic violence? Ooh, good question there.
Indeed, it would be, Aria. So that in any one of these kind of findings, there's a whole number of different factors which could be influencing things like that. I can send through the paper to Frida, and then perhaps that could be shared, and the questioner can pore over their methods, but I believe there's been an attempt as much as you can to correct for the other factors, to isolate out what is the influence of the green space in that situation. But let's think about it in the sense of, it does make sense, because when you look at nature or vegetation to a certain degree, the amount of stress you're feeling decreases, your heart rate decreases. And this is because we're not engineered to live in cities. Like the full sweep of our evolutionary history has not been in cities, it's been in nature. And so cities tend to wind us up. If you live in a house with a view of a freeway, the level of stress you carry with you day in, day out is going to be very different to living in a house looking at a national park or something. So we know instinctively that it's kind of true that you feel less stress. And then, connections with domestic violence, I think, are fairly evident. But yes, I will send the papers through to Frida, and then the questioner can have a good look at that. And sorry, I don't have a more detailed answer.
Great stuff. Thank you. All right, then we've got a couple of comments about Singapore, and one question here. To what extent do you think Singapore, city in nature, was Garden City, has delivered God?
Yeah, I think Singapore is a wonderful example, isn't it, of how you can weave biodiversity in amongst density. So while there's a model there which I think has been really successful, it's very difficult to apply the same rules in some other cities. For instance, the way we have biodiversity in Perth, it's a lot thinner, it's a lot drier, and there's a kind of integrity to the rainforest sort of vegetation that you get in Singapore, which is easier to marry with urban development. But this, and also, I think a lot of the really great work by companies like Woha, who are building, buildings which are dripping with greenery. Some of that is very difficult to do in a very arid climate like Perth is rapidly becoming. So I think it's inspiration. It can be found in Singapore, but it's not necessarily a direct model which could be replicated in Australia, for instance.
Probably a big thing that always comes to mind for me whenever I see Singapore is the abundance of mature trees, and it really, really hammers home the idea that you really have to consider knocking down trees for development. Yeah, that's what makes Singapore so special for me.
Good point. Cool. All right. A few more comments here. People have really enjoyed the presentation. A few links to documents. Julian, does state government help fund parks in Australia? Land acquisition, development and maintenance costs are an ongoing issue in the New Zealand context.
Yeah, so the state government, in my understanding of this, is more involved in a kind of regional open space. So that's a much larger open space where the local governments typically are responsible for the upkeep of and development of smaller parks. So what we really need, one of the ideas with G.O.D, which I didn't really go into, is that as you get much more density happening, you have more dwellings and households paying local rates and taxes, and therefore the local government has more money to be directed or to be directed towards the maintenance of elaborate open space. So the kind of parks which I was showing in the presentation are mostly local government operated parks. So we're trying to work with the kind of a model there which could see local governments funded to maintain them at a high level. But state government is generally looking at the much larger regional open space.
Right. Okay. And then I think we have a follow-up question on this. Anything in the wind that the situation might change? The math still doesn't add up with the density planned in New Zealand.
It's a great question, Beck, and wow, you guys are really good. You're really getting me on the detail here. I'm not much for details, guys. You're probably gathering. But I would go back to Olmsted, and when he was trying to get Central Park laid out in Manhattan, when Manhattan Island was not fully developed, he was able to argue for it to people who were quite averse to providing that much open space by actually going through and calculating the uplift that the park would have in all the areas around it. So there are long established relationships between open space and property values. So whether or not you would be able to yield the kind of park I've visualized exactly with just the money generated through local council rates and taxes, I am not sure, but it would definitely help. Alan, I sense you want to jump in there.
Yeah, I mean, somebody on this has also recommended the Are We Building Harder, Hotter Cities? I would recommend that document to everybody to read. And that's where I grabbed a couple of these facts I said earlier from. In there as well, there's a bit of a discussion around and that recalibration I was talking about with regards to green space landscape architecture, about it going from where it is now to critical green infrastructure, and why that might seem like a semantic about terminology. What it does is it puts it in different funding models, puts it in different statutory areas, and it recalibrates its importance. That does give it the business case then for those conversations. The status quo we have now does not allow it to sit in the right funding space to give it the kind of funding that something that is absolutely critical needs. That's kind of take we've got from that document.
Nice. And I think someone's popped a link into that Harder, Hotter Cities document in the chat. So thank you for that. So I think this is a question here. You have not mentioned going up rather than infill. In much of Wellington, there is less scope left for infill and talk of promoting buildings up to 6 stories anywhere near transit hubs. Yeah. Any comments on building up?
Well, obviously, I think density around transit of a significant kind is a much preferred model. Our surveys show that communities support it more. We know that planners support it more. I'd be curious about the differences, but in Australia, we run into all kinds of issues when a building gets to 3 stories. You suddenly need unionised labour. Your fire regulations get much more onerous. And so there's all kinds of issues which mean that while there is some of that form of development going on, it's so much easier just to carve up back gardens rather than doing that consolidated sort of development, which typically also requires consolidating fragmented lots. So much of our suburban landscape is fragmented into effectively now quite small lots, and it's really hard to get this kind of site that you need to do something significant, such as the questioner is indicating. So I think there's a general consensus that's what we need to be doing, but we're just finding there's all kinds of hurdles to it happening.
Great, thank you. Probably got time for one last question, so we'll go to the one at the bottom. Rooftop gardening, what's its role in Australia?
It would seem at the moment very little. It's not playing very much of a role. We did a huge project analysing apartment buildings and mental health across Perth, Melbourne and Sydney. And it was really hard to find in those podium sort of rooftop landscapes one real mature tree that could generate significant shade, for instance. And we know that some of that is about the cost and structural issues of putting a lot of soil on roofs. But what we're finding is those spaces, even despite the marketing imagery of apartment developments being dripping in green space, the reality is it's not really being delivered. And I think the general consensus is it's quite expensive, it's quite complicated. And certainly where you can provide green space on the ground in higher density developments, it seems to be a much better outcome because you can get those deep soil zones, get the big trees in and really go for it.
Great, thank you. I think we're out of time now, and I'll pass back to Frida, but there's lots of great points and links in the chat. So yeah, if people have time, do take a look through the comments in there. Right, back to you, Frida.
Thank you so much, Aria, and thank you, Julian and Alan. I know we're at 1:30. I sort of going to be cheeky, and if people have to leave, then thank you so much for joining us today. There'll be an email coming with the links, the presentations. But maybe just one final question for both of you, Alan and Julian. Perhaps where you've seen successful uptake of the kind of the G.O.D concept and what you think the big trends will be for 2024. Just a cliche question there, but curious on those forward-looking thoughts.
I'll defer to you first, Alan, if that's okay.
What the trends are? Yeah, well, look, I think from a practical level, what we've actually seen, just the first thing that comes to my mind is what we've actually seen recently is a change in the way our clients are talking about this. And quite often from consultancy level, that's the kind of the trend that you follow because of how we do our business. But we're starting to see RFPs coming from the market that say we want landscape architects leading this particular space, where 5 years ago, we were not seeing that. So we're starting to see on the ground in terms of how people want to run their projects, an elevation of consideration of all things landscape and green, and bringing in a whole bunch of conversations about sponge cities and resilience. I think the big shift we're seeing is a shift from our clients. And so, there's a long way to go, but it's a really positive shift. It feels like a really great time to be a landscape architect and an urban designer in New Zealand right now. Lots of positivity in that space. And we're very excited to see what's coming next for New Zealand.
I wanted to pick up on Alan's point there. I think it is a great time to be a landscape architect, urban designer, urban planner. We have so many huge problems we're facing, whether it's stubborn reliance on carbon, fossil fuels, climate change, societal kind of fragmentation. And I think, you can feel quite paralyzed by all of these huge issues we're facing, But in a way, these huge issues need huge solutions and small solutions. And I think they need creative engagement. There's a kind of paralysis which goes with so many of the problems we're facing. But I think designers and planners have the skill set to engage with them creatively. And to creatively engage with these challenges, I think is really important, to weave new narratives and new dreams. And I guess that's what we're trying to do with G.O.D. But I think to take these things which we otherwise just try to manage and creatively engage with them, I think is the key. So to pick up on Alan's point, I think the urban professions and the landscape professions have a huge role in that creative engagement, which could successfully recast this kind of paralysis I think many of us are feeling. So that's my tip for the year, but it's probably more a tip for the decade, I guess. Sorry, it's not very specific.
No, I think that's brilliant. Yeah, so thank you so much for those final thoughts. I like what you said at the beginning about needing a more qualitative assessment of what we're trying to achieve with the densification. So yeah, just again, I guess a huge thank you just to close off. The interest in the webinar indicates how much people's values are already there. So now it's just our way of collectively figuring out how to shift the more dominant narratives to build that sort of the lifeboat or the
lifeboat cities.
Yeah. I guess everyone's got to go back to work. So huge thank you, Julian and Alan, for your time. And it was just a real honour, and everyone encourage you to keep these conversations going and to buy the book and support Julian's publishing career. So huge thank you.
Cheers. Thanks, Frida. Thanks, Alan.
Thanks all. Appreciate turning up.
Ka kite.
Ka kite.
Bye.